Okay, there we go. I also wanted to make a note that closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button to view the live transcription, or we also have a live captioner that is capturing all of this as we're going, and their transcript can be accessed by clicking on the link that I have included in the chat. So welcome everyone. My name is Marisha Lopez. I'm the program manager for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. And thank you all for joining us for this workshop on creating trans-affirming universities. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to reflect on your relationship to this land of Boulder and your relationship to local Indigenous communities as we are guided by the university's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. So I'd like to introduce our workshop facilitator today. Megan, or Maggie Nanney, serves as the Equal Opportunity and Diversity Research Associate in East Carolina University's Office for Equity and Diversity. Their current research examines how inequality is reproduced within workplace, education, and healthcare settings, despite an organization's good intentions and commitments to DEI. Maggie's most recent project ethnographically examines transgender students' experiences within historically women's colleges. In addition to their professional role, Maggie consults with Campaign for Southern Equality's Southern Research and Policy Center, and previously served as the chair for sociologists for Trans Justice. Welcome, Maggie.
Hello, everyone. 2.5 years in and I still can't find that unmute button, but I am so happy to be with everyone here today, especially as we embark on Trans Day of Remembrance. And today I'm going to be speaking with you and working with you about creating trans-affirming universities. And I have a PowerPoint, which I'm going to hopefully be able to launch here. As soon as I do that, though, I cannot see you all. So let's try. I actually do not. There we go. I actually don't even have screen sharing abilities. Can I have those abilities, please?
Yes, hold on.
Thank you. Sorry, everyone, but that's okay. But I'll go ahead and talk as we get that going. So what my introduction or my bio says is I work in the Office for Equity and Diversity at East Carolina University, as well as a researcher for the Campaign for Southern Equality. My area of expertise happens to be transgender students in university settings with a specialization of historically gendered colleges. I was also the former chair of Sociologists for Justice, as well as former faculty at Smith and Hollins University. And what we're going to be doing today, let's see, I'm actually going to just unplug my second monitor and see if we can get this to work a little bit better this way. Sorry, everyone, technology. Let's see. I'll zoom to share my screen. Of course, I don't have my settings allowed to let me do that. What we'll be doing today is we will be talking about, I can't talk and type in a password at the same time, everyone. Let's see, there we go. Oh no, it's saying that I cannot do this at the same time. It's a new computer, everyone. I am so sorry. am I able to jump out and then jump right back in? It's saying that in order to reset my settings.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm so sorry, everyone. I will be right back. Okay, everyone, let's try that again. So I need my capabilities reshared with me, and then we should be set to go. There we go. Perfect. Now you can see my screen. Yay. Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to be talking to you about creating trans-affirming universities. And I already introduced myself a little bit. And what we're going to be doing first is I'm going to give you some orientations to the work, how we're going to be talking about it today. And then I'm going to be sharing a story with you from one particular student that I've worked with. Their name is Devin. And I have some asterisks there because I do want to share early on, and I will set a reminder when it comes closer to the time. There is a content warning with Devin's story. There's mention of police violence, as well as drug and alcohol abuse, sexual violence. I don't go into graphic detail with it, but I do mention it. And I believe it's important to share, especially as it is part of Devin's story, and Devin wants this story to be shared. But just so everyone knows, there is a content warning with the story. And then we're going to shift into a little bit of academic language, talking about administrative violence. And what does that mean, especially in the context of Trans Day of Remembrance? And why is this important when we're talking about creating trans-affirming universities? And then finally, we're going to talk about what does that mean, or what does that even look like? And we'll have some discussion about some questions that I've set up throughout the PowerPoint in order for us to facilitate that imagining and that creating that community space together. And then finally have some time for questions here at the end. And I'm already going to tell you right away what we're going to get out of this. That's the agenda, but what are the three main points that I want us to get out of today's time together? The first of which is that gender norms impact us all. When we're talking about gender in higher education, gender is ingrained in every aspect of higher education. And so it touches every single person's lives, regardless of your gender identity. But we also need to recognize that these norms unequally target trans and non-binary people, putting them at higher risk for violence, exclusion, and other negative consequences. Second, we also need to focus, or we will realize that commitments to gender diversity and inclusion are not enough. Just saying that we are gender diverse, or saying that we are gender inclusive, or that we are committed to that without having action can actually further exacerbate inequality. And then finally, we're going to talk about how trans affirmation requires transformative change on campus. Once again, because just words isn't enough, we need to think or rethink, how do we bring about change? And that really focuses on the material realities of trans oppression. Also, as we get started, I want to lay a few guidelines for us, since we will have the opportunity to talk with one another, either using the chat function, or I welcome you to come off mute and share as well. And so the first of which, first and foremost, is that trans existence, rights, and belonging are not up for debate, especially in the context of this presentation and today. We are not debating these things. We are recognizing that trans people exist and that they have an equal right to be in these spaces. We also need to be mindful and use our productive language, but we also need to, I'm jumping over to the fourth one here, have a growth mindset and have some leniency, realize that this is a learning space. And so we have the opportunity to learn. Sometimes we make mistakes as long as they are well-intentioned, and having that grace with one another. Third, I'm going to encourage us to think intersectionally, and that means for us to think about not just gender, but the ways that in which oppression is intertwined with multiple identities. And then finally, I want to encourage you to take care of yourself and others as needed. I know, at least for myself, I'm located in North Carolina, so it's 5 p.m. My partner actually just kind of scooted on right by. And so taking care of families, if you need to get up and take care of yourself, please do so. I encourage you to do that, because some of this topic and some of these conversations can be tough at times. So I want to actually start right away by having a conversation. I hate hearing myself talk, ironically, as I'm the speaker here today. So I'm going to encourage you all to talk. And I have a warm-up question here for you on the screen, and I would like you to reflect on, where do you see or where do you experience gender on campus? And feel free to just come off mute or open up chat. Feel free. I see sororities and fraternities, bathrooms in the chat. Internal HR systems, classrooms, pronouns in Zoom rooms, yes. Health insurance, forms, great. Ooh, theater program casting, legal paperwork, classroom, health services. These are all great examples. Any others? Appreciation events, grad student spaces. Sports, yes, those are a big one. Any others? Agree with everywhere, yes. Fellowships and grants. Promotions and wage levels, statistics and record keeping. Give people a few more seconds to type if you're typing. This is already an excellent list, and exactly what I was hoping that we were starting already to think about, right? That as someone mentioned in the chat, gender is everywhere. And this is just an example of some of the other ones that people have told me before, right? Looking at admissions, my own research in particular looks at colleges that limit based on a particular gender. We can talk about the curriculum, even the language that we use, right? I'm in the South, so sir and ma'am is common, but we can also think about the term freshman, right? Right there is gender, right in our language. Our applications, who's in leadership positions. Some schools filter advising based on gender. Locker rooms, residence halls. There's so many different places across campus, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to identify as transgender for gender to show up in these spaces, right? Gender impacts us all. And that's the first point that I want us to really start thinking about, is that gender impacts us all because gender is everywhere. Even in seemingly neutral scenarios or settings where we might not necessarily think that gender is important or gender is the point of focus, it's still present in shaping how we think and how we act and how we present ourselves. And yet at the same time, we know that gender norms disproportionately target and impact transgender people. I took out a slide, but earlier I was going to have a slide that defines transgender, but I purposely took that out because I wanted us to also be challenged in thinking about what transgender even means and what that can encompass. One definition doesn't necessarily or defining it bounds it, right? And that we're going to be challenging that a little bit today. But when we're talking about transgender people as a population, especially, it is this refusal of being defined, this refusal of following norms or maybe even challenging those norms that can lead to this disproportionate targeting. And so I want to give an example story here of Devin, and we'll talk a little bit about why or how these gender norms can disproportionately affect transgender people. Here on the screen, you'll see 3 questions that I want you to think about while I share Devin's story. And that is very similar to the question that we just warmed up with. How does gender shape Devin's experience? And then how does Devin's other identities, such as race or class, impact Devin's gendered experience? And then finally, why did the college's commitment to gender diversity and inclusion fail? And as I mentioned in the introduction, there is a content warning for some of Devin's story. So if you need to go off mute or if you need to step away, that's absolutely more than fine. And I'm going to read from my interview or my conversation from Devin pretty strictly from Devin's words, because I feel that they're important to be honored. But let me tell you a little bit about Devin before we get started. So I was introduced to Devin as a person I should absolutely get to know for my project through my campus sponsor at the one college that I was studying, which I'll call Athena for the purposes of today, who had Devin as a student in the class the year prior. We had a series of bounce back emails, and after months of not replying to me, Devin finally responded and asked that we would meet at a local diner, not too unlike the one that you see on the screen in front of you, because they did not feel comfortable meeting anywhere on campus. So we sat at a small round table in the back along a wall where the track lighting didn't quite reach the table, allowing us to sit in this really warm glow surrounded by the sounds of silverware and plates clanging and instrumental experimental jazz playing over the sound system, kind of painting a picture for you here where we were. And in all of my interviews with over 150 transgender students across the United States, I always offer to buy like a small treat or coffee for their time. And when I asked Devin, they asked sheepishly if they could order a whole meal. And I come to find out that this was Devin's first real meal of the week, and it was Thursday. In between bites of scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, orange slices, and red grapes, Devin would look up to continue relaying their story to me, only to return for longer periods of chewing rather than speaking. Devin's situation, while extreme, was not the first of its kind that I had heard. Rather, Devin was failed by a host of offices, employees, and support systems at their college, all on account of their trans identity, that then left them isolated and vulnerable on campus. While formally, Devin's college prided itself on being trans inclusive, stating that they welcomed all people of all genders on campus, and they had a non-discrimination policy that included gender identity, saying that discrimination on the basis of gender would not be tolerated. They had a safe zone training and even a brand new website for student resources such as an LGBTQ student group and links to informational readings on pronouns. Yet trans students like Devin experienced continued and compounding barriers to this stated commitment to inclusion, thereby in reality providing only really broken promises. In effect, trans identities and experiences do not match the picture of inclusion that these policies had painted. As Eli Ehrlich writes, a policy on transgender inclusion alone, while critically important for institutions of higher learning to have, they cannot change the rampant transphobia and cis-sexism in education systems and society. Education and properly instituted safety measures are vital for a healthy campus community. And yet many of the resources that were available to students like Devin failed, which leads us to think about how environments should not only admit trans students, but how, in the words of Gina Garcia, can become trans-affirming institutions. So during the time that I had met Devin, they were a senior in college majoring in gender studies. They were, for all intents and purposes, the ideal student. Devin was an exceptionally bright student, was a talented runner, and was recruited for the campus team. They had tons of friends early on in college and had a campus job in student housing that paid for their room and board. They were involved in student leadership, their queer people of color student organization, and interned for the diversity office, and was just generally one of those people that everyone knew. Tall yet broad, Devin would quickly garner the attention of the room with her large smile and outgoing personality. And yet, as Devin came into their identity as non-binary, things quickly turned south for them. Describing their experience as one steeped in institutionalized transphobia, Devin explained, and this is in their own words, "I was shutting down someone's birthday party or whatever. It was an underage and not registered, and it was extremely loud, and that person happened to be on my team and an ex-friend. And that person was friends with their house president, and that house president was extremely drunk. Everyone was drunk. And they harassed me, and they were making comments about my appearance and a lot like that. And it's not okay. And also, as like a non-binary person who's still struggling with their own self-image, it was just very shitty. And I ended up over at my assistant coach's apartment that night because I was suicidal. The coaches ended up suspending the person on the team. And the coach said multiple times, this behavior is absolutely unacceptable. I don't want this on my team. But they didn't address the team about this person or what had happened. And then they ended up giving the suspended teammate the coach's award at the end of the year. And then I had established a very close relationship with this friend who was also on the team. And we kind of got together because they had a huge crush on me. They had never kissed a queer person, let alone a trans person. And they used me in a not so great way. But that was my only friend. So yeah, that was really painful. I ended up wanting to quit the team, and I was like to my coach, I want to let you know that I'm quitting. I know that you can't understand that because I want to start taking testosterone, and I can't run for a year according to NCAA rules. And that was an extremely difficult conversation for me because running had been part of my life since I was 2, and a huge part of my identity was being a runner, and to not only have to quit the team that I loved and the sport that I loved, but to have to do it to make that decision, like, okay, I need to figure out my identity stuff here. That was extremely hard. And then instead of being a supporting person, my coach actually got up and yelled at me, said how she had spent so much time and effort on me that I wouldn't have gotten into college without her. Later that day, she sent me an email back saying, I expect a written explanation as to why my number 1 runner quit, and I will be sending this to your teammates, assistant coaches, other head coaches, and to the administration. And so I did that, and I ended up reading it in front of my entire team while crying. So yeah, that happened. And then from there on started the isolation because I didn't have my team. They were my friends and family. So that summer I had gotten Potato, which is Devin's emotional support dog. I adopted her from a shelter and I submitted all the paperwork, but it didn't go through. So they put me on academic probation. And I'm fairly close with the people in residence life, so they felt that they needed to put me on probation not to show favoritism, which makes sense. I was still kind of bitter though, because I had my paperwork. And then I think this was all within 1 week that I had been disowned from my family. And my grandma told me all this stuff about mental illness and how being trans wasn't a thing. She doesn't believe in homophobia, transphobia. You can't say that. So it was all very upsetting. But then another student was in my house and had been flirting with me in a span of 4 days, was very transphobic, asking a lot of extremely personal questions, like taking my binder off, asking if I pack, just stuff you don't ask somebody, especially if you don't know them. Not a very positive relationship at all. We had been talking about previous relationships, and I had noticed that they were only seeing trans masculine people. I brought that up and saying, hey, are you aware of this This is a thing. And now I'm feeling kind of objectified because you're doing some things to me that I don't really like. And she flipped out and said, I have to leave. And I ended up getting fired because she went to residence life and complained, saying that she didn't feel comfortable. So yeah, I was really isolated. I had to move from my home. I lost my job. I didn't have my team. I didn't have my workmates. There was a lot of transphobic stuff that had happened. I literally had no friends, which is bad. And that's when things took a real downturn. I was really isolated. I didn't have my team. I didn't have my best friend. I didn't have res life. I started drinking a lot, and that led me to my first hospital stay. I was in the hospital for 17 days, and then I came back for 2 weeks. And within those 2 weeks, I ended up having a really bad altercation with campus police. I had gotten locked out of my new dorm one early morning after stepping outside for a smoke. It was February, and we had just had one of those famous New England snows, so it was super cold outside, and I was wearing my pajamas. I rang the doorbell, and no one answered. I sat outside for an hour while other students walked by, all of them able to swipe me in with a key card, but none of them looked at me. Then campus police showed up saying someone called concerned about me. No, not about me, concerned because of me. Not because I was locked out, but concerned that I was trying to break in. I tried explaining that I lived there, but I guess they didn't think that a large Black guy like me could be living in a women's dorms. Because I had been on T since October, so it was probably like 4 or 5 months or 4 or 6 months. So he didn't believe that I was a student and kept yelling at me and misgendering me. And then I got really uncomfortable and I started to laugh. But he thought that I was kidding, that I was suicidal, that I was threatening him. And he was like, I think you're on something. He was literally saying, stop fucking with me. What are you doing here? So he called another campus police person because he thought I was suicidal, and they called an ambulance, and I got a little combative with them because the officer was using she, her pronouns for me after I said my pronouns, and he misgendered me. And there was another campus police officer making fun of me, so I kicked his car. And then they held me down, forced me into an ambulance. I had bruises all down this arm and all down the other arm because the officer was on each side of me. And I got to the hospital and all I remember is screaming and then putting me on suicide watch and for me begging them not to do it. It's been 3 years since I spoke with Devin in this interview, and Devin has since returned to the hospital 4 more times, including 3 extended stays in mental health retreat facilities and joining AA. Devin had to take medical leave from college, putting them behind in their studies and without a home, source of income, their emotional support animal, family, or friends. I am proud to say that Devin's doing a whole lot better. As they told me in their last email communication, it was a low point and every day is hard, but I'm one of the lucky ones. So while I share Devin's story with you today, know that it's not unique. I constantly hear similar stories from others across the United States, from public to private, religious to secular, large to small, co-ed to gender-selective colleges. Again and again, I hear trans students detail the broken promises of inclusion, support, and belonging that their colleges had offered and failed to deliver. Yet these experiences are also really far from being universal. Students of low socioeconomic means, queer sexualities, neurodivergent abilities, and students of color like Devin particularly detailed stories of exclusion, isolation, and harm done onto them, not only by the institution, but by their peers as well, as they didn't fit into the campus college gender norms. I chose to share Devin's story with you all today, not because it's the most extreme example, but because it details the compounding effects of individual, institutional, and administrative barriers to inclusion for trans students. So race, mental health, athletics, Title IX, student affairs, housing, counseling services, campus police, they all play an integral role in Devin's experience of isolation. By treating inclusion policies as a fits-all solution. As Sarah Ahmed would say, inclusion policies become non-performative. They only name the effect in which they attempt to create. Inclusion then is limited to only the gates of the institution, and the existing gendered structures of colleges and universities continue to negatively impact all student lives, but especially transgender students. So now what I want us to do, and I don't think, oops, didn't mean to show you the next slide. I don't think we're going to break off into small groups just for time, but I do want us to reflect on these 3 questions that I had posed. How does gender shape Devon's experience? And how do Devon's others' identities shape that experience? And then finally, why did the college's commitment to gender diversity inclusion fail? So I would love to hear your thoughts. How did gender shape Devon's experience? Feel free to put in the chat or come off mute and share your thoughts.
I can help you with the chat, Maggie.
Thank you.
So Amanda said Devon's experience makes it clear that their gender and gender performance, along with race, class, have oppressed and caused violence towards them.
Yes. What are other thoughts? And I've taught college courses, y'all. I can wait you all out. Don't worry.
I love that. I did want to point out, I'm sure everyone, noticed this, but at the beginning of the story, when the team as a whole wasn't addressed about the incident that had happened, and then later that teammate was awarded, that seemed like a big failure.
Yes. Great example.
It's also interesting because I wonder, is there a world where that coach could have been like, you know what, yes, you can't compete, but you're still welcome to come and be part of our team. And how supportive would that have been to just kind of have that structure, have the team, if the team was open to, accepting and affirming of Devon. That's a thing that I don't know, really bothers me, and people weren't willing to look past the gender piece for the sport.
Mm-hmm.
In the chat, Morgan said campus entities such as the police department, athletics, residence life are themselves trans competent or inclusive.
Right.
Gender seemed to shape everything through the entire experience, from their initial realization of being trans to transitioning to others assuming gender. Someone else said that the other student was believed in the conflict rather than Devon.
Right.
And expectations of gender and gender presentation along with race resulted in exclusion from their dorm and police being called. Another person mentioned that campus police needs to be trained in trans-affirming approaches. Aiden says a lot of the time, non-conforming expression of gender is seen as a laughable or shameful mental illness. We aren't treated like people, and this ties into ableism as well, with people looking down on mental illnesses and then using that as an excuse to treat us trans people like garbage. Sometimes because they know that the systems meant to help and protect people won't help and protect us the same way they do cis and even cis passing people.
These are all really great examples. I know I think the chat's probably going to keep going, and I love for the chat to keep going, but I do want us to stay on time a little bit. So already, right, I want everyone to notice the types of comments that were coming through, right? Talking about how gender shaped Devon's experience, and already contrast that to the opening question that I had us reflect on. How does gender show up on campus, right? Here, earlier, we were just talking about different examples, right? Restrooms, we were talking about locker rooms or administrative forms. But then here in Devon's example, we can see really concrete ways in which it doesn't just show up, but how it actually shapes the opportunities, the lived chances that Devon has, and how they build upon one another. And this brings us to a concept, and I told you, very, very brief academic-y, I promise, but there's this concept that comes from the work of Dean Spade, who is a legal scholar, a trans-legal scholar, and runs the Sylvia Rivera Project, called administrative violence. And in this concept, we recognize that from even before we're born, right, we have these gender reveal parties or ultrasounds that declare whether someone's a boy or someone's a girl, to even beyond the time in which we die. Those gender boxes, that M and F, they follow us wherever we go. And yet these seemingly neutral categories, they're not just reflective of the world we live in, they're not just reflective of who we are, but they also govern how we can move around this world. And consequently, the most marginalized trans people experience more extreme vulnerability because more aspects of their lives are directly controlled by these administrative systems of domination that employ rigid gender binaries. So in Dean Spade's work, he gives an example of a bus pass. And in one city, they actually had gender markers on a city bus pass, and how people wouldn't be able to access public transportation, which is an affordable means of transportation, because they couldn't get their sex marker changed, because there was a whole process of getting legal documentation, which required medical changes, which requires years of doctor's approvals, let alone having the money to be able to afford that, all for a bus pass. And because they couldn't change their bus pass, they couldn't go to work to make money, which put them more predisposed to experience houselessness or to lose their job or not be able to get an education. And as we can see in Devon's experience, these seemingly neutral systems, or these seemingly genderless systems, right? We don't necessarily always attribute gender to campus policing, but they're inherently tied to one another, and they build upon one another to create life chances. And they can create systems of oppression and real violence on campus. It's not necessarily always something that's physical. It's not always just misgendering, but the ways in which people can even access the system in equal ways is also a form of violence. And this leads to disproportional impacts for trans and non-binary populations. In recent data efforts, and I have citations in a folder, which I'll show you later. In recent efforts, this comes from the United States Transgender Discrimination Survey, we know that 87% of trans people have at least some college. That is disproportionately higher than most populations. Trans people are highly, highly educated, and yet they also experience disproportionate violence on campus and in these institutions. 78% of trans people experience harassment on the basis of their gender. 69% experience social exclusion. 35% experience physical assault. And up to 15% of trans people drop out of college and education and broadly due to the harassment in which they experience on campus. So then this leads us to really think about, how do we go from just admitting trans students, saying, come here on campus, to affirming trans identity? And this is really where we're going to end up for today. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I imagine trans affirmation to be. Trans-affirmation is a movement beyond merely accepting trans people into the current fabric of our universities, how they currently already operate. And it's a radical shift in how gender is created and maintained in university settings, beginning with the material realities of trans people themselves. And there's 5 tenets of what creating trans-affirming colleges and universities looks like. The first of which is an equity mindset. And this is a shift in how we think about inequality and oppression, from moving from blaming the individual or thinking about the individual as the problem that needs to be treated, to turning towards the institutions themselves and seeing what are the policies, what are the structures in place that create unequal opportunities or create barriers to access and success. Second, as we've already established, we need to recognize that gender mediates everyone's lives. And it's not only important for us to recognize that it just mediates our own lives, but it's because it then creates a stake for everyone. Because if it impacts everyone, then everyone has a role in changing how gender is done on campus. And as a result of this, this also releases trans people and gives them more time and attention to build and maintain quality and successful relationships, as well as the resources necessary, rather than having to struggle to survive day to day to justify their existence if that work is shared. While we're sharing that work, however, onto the third tenet, we need to center trans people in this work. Trans people are often excluded from positions of leadership that have a say on the policies and resources that are going to directly impact their lives. In my own research, I look at admissions policies at gendered colleges, and across the, I believe, 42 women's colleges that are still in existence, there have been 2 trans people that have had a say in those policies. 42 colleges, 2 people. We need to center trans people in this work. And so in order to create trans-affirming universities, this work has to trickle up, centering and starting with the most marginalized communities in that decision-making process. Fourth is we need to recommit to an intersectional practice, because trans people are people. We're diverse and we're intersectional. We have other identities that are not just our gender, and our gender, as we saw with Devon's experience, is impacted by our other identities. So by committing to an intersectional praxis, we're calling for institutions to find ways to honor the complexities of our lives and our experiences through the college environment, including policy, our resources, programs, and all the multitude of other ways, and uncover the ways in which, as an institution, these interlocking systems of oppression exist on campus. And then finally, we need to move beyond just Trans 101 and best practices. As I mentioned earlier, I took out my slide that defines transgender. I'm not going over what pronouns are in this talk. While it's important that we have this education, that education is for cisgender people. It's once again centering cisgenderness rather than focusing on trans people and their material realities. And so that's really what going beyond Trans 101 is. It's focusing on the realities that trans people face on campus and eliminating those real barriers in order to realize full inclusion and success. Moving beyond requires us to recognize that we can never fully achieve inclusion. There's never a singular point of arrival where we can say, we're inclusive, we're done. We can't do that. Rather, we have to see our work as being about practice, process, reflection, and continual self-evaluation. So what does this look like? I have a few examples here on the slide, and I want to emphasize that this is an incomplete list. We're not looking for a checklist where we can say, okay, we've done 1 through 11, we're done, we're inclusive. But rather, these are just examples of ways in which we can move beyond those best practices while centering trans people in those intersectional differences, including the ability to update your name and pronouns in a multitude of ways on campus, from your student IDs to student rosters to diplomas and transcripts. Making sure that there's trans health and medical services on campus, mental health services, training and development, that's your Trans 101, still important, still need to have it on campus. Scholarships and financial wellness, gender inclusive forums, making sure your non-discrimination policy has gender identity as well as gender presentation included. Having inclusive campus spaces, inclusive campus organizations, including athletics, if we're thinking about the example of Devon, inclusive curriculum, who are we learning about in our curriculum and how are we learning about them? Having dedicated support staff, and a multitude of other things that can be done on campus to create trans-affirming colleges. And we're going to do a quick activity to think about that here in just a second. But I do want to highlight these 2 pictures on this side as well. These are just 2 examples that also happen to be blue, so they tie in beautifully with the slide, of 2 colleges that have created trans-affirming resources on campus. Mount Holyoke actually just announced yesterday a brand new policy about pronoun sharing and disclosure, where they're mandating that pronouns are shared and that they're respected on campus, and so that it has teeth to that policy. It's not just a commitment to saying we're going to do better, but there's a real backing to it. And then at Ithaca College, actually a resource that was led by trans communities, they have a voice and communication modification resource for people in the transgender community, where people can learn how to retrain their voice in their health services department. So just another example of ways in which we can be reinventive, centering trans communities and changing the material realities on campus. But I'm not going to have all the answers. I'm not you, I'm not on your campus. And so what I want us to do for the next 5 minutes is to brainstorm just really quickly. What can a trans-affirming college campus look like for you? What are things that you can do to transform your university to go from trans-accepting to trans-affirming? Again, feel free to use the chat or come off mute. I know it's a big question. There are no wrong answers, though. This is where you get to be imaginative. Time off for trans-affirming care. I love it. Highlight trans experiences and figures throughout history throughout the curriculum. Hiring trans people, yes, talk about changing material realities, putting them in leadership positions. Leadership by example, having professors emphasize their own pronouns in Zoom, emails, online. What are other thoughts? It also goes so quickly, I can't always read them all.
When employees are hired, asking them their preferred name before they set them up in the system and give them an email address.
That's great, yes.
Multiple gender options in the HR system. I think there's a lot of things around that HR system.
Oh yes, and that HR system follows you, right? That's how you're identified. That's how they communicate with you. Our systems are very, very important to be inclusive.
Policy of covering gender affirming care costs. Waitlists and covering changes can result in covered care being unexpectedly not covered for folks.
Great example.
Accessible gender neutral bathrooms.
Yes. And let's emphasize that accessible too, right? It's oftentimes when we have gender neutral restrooms, they're inaccessible to people with mobility disabilities. And so thinking intersectionally here, how can we create these restrooms to be accessible not only by gender, but by ability and mobility? And having them in every restroom, and having maps or communication so people know where they are and being able to access them. This is great. Any other imaginations or any other thoughts? Support for athletes. Yes.
Maggie, I'm kind of curious. So there are things that, like, all these are amazing ideas, but then there's things that are outside of CU's control. For example, I know that they make employees put genders in some of the HR things because health insurance requires it. And we have laws that say how we have to have so many men and women's bathrooms that are dictated by the state. So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are, because that's some of the stuff that we come up against. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I actually asked Dean Spade this question myself. So I'm so glad I get to share this answer as well. So yes, we do have to work within our systems at times, right? I live in North Carolina where Don't Say Gay is on the legislature yet again, and it's going to pass this time around. So we have to work within the systems. That doesn't mean that we can't lobby our systems, first of all. And two, there are ways in which we can build multitudes. So I'm going to use the HR example, right? Yes, we have to use forms for healthcare and for data reporting purposes, but why can't we capture, or why can't we collect a robust data set with multiple gender identities and then use that data in multiple ways? For example, I can collect both sex identity and gender identity. Sometimes I have to report sex, recognizing that that can be problematic, but other times I can use my more robust data set of gender identity to have a more clear picture. Because if we're only collecting the binary gender, then we're erasing identities. Whereas if we have both, then we can use them in appropriate context when we're able to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and like with the HR example, with that one, even just saying why they're needing that, I think can also be helpful. I mean, it's also hard because, you know, as you mentioned, transgender healthcare, and full disclosure, my wife is a trans woman who actually transitioned on the CU Boulder campus and actually had a pretty good experience with it. So that is one of the better stories that are out there. But yeah, I think sometimes the context of like, why are you asking for this, can be helpful.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, you all hear my dog. Yes, so, and I think that's partly why we can't just move beyond Trans 101. We still need to also have Trans 101 information. We still need to educate, but we need to build upon that. We can't just be stuck at Trans 101. So I think it's a both and in many ways. Providing that education, explaining why it's important to collect this information and getting that buy-in. I think I also saw a hand, but then it disappeared.
I think that person put something in the chat. Marissa said passports are now actually able to have X gender markers, and we need to be compliant. I've been talking with the HCM folks about getting this option. There is apparently an update from Oracle in the works, but it has been delayed for at least a year now.
Yeah, exactly. Any other immediate thoughts on this? Do you want to make sure we have some time for questions? So let me wrap up real quick and then I'll open it up. So on your screen here, I have a picture from one of my classes that I taught on transgender studies. And I always ask my students at the end of the class, what does a gender affirming college look like? Or what does trans euphoria look like? Yes, it's a feeling, but also what can we imagine it to be? I'm always about the imagination of it. And so this is actually what they put together as a class for us. So thinking about the ways in which, one, the colors, right? That's what I see almost immediately, is the vibrancy of gender euphoria and gender affirmation. But then also people coming together, supporting one another, whether that be in protest or in community, thinking about supporting one another, having gender affirmation in multitudes of ways. So again, here's what we've talked about today. I know we only had a very short hour, but we talked about how gender norms impact us all. Gender is ubiquitous on campus, but we can also recognize that it particularly targets trans and non-binary people. We also talked about how commitments to gender diversity and inclusion are not enough. They're important to have, yes, but if that's all we have, they can exacerbate inequality. And then finally, we talked about how gender affirmation requires transformative change, and we need to focus on the material realities of trans oppression on campus. So with that, I'm going to stop and let you ask some questions. I will also share this PowerPoint at the end. There's this QR code that you'll have access to a public Google Doc, where I have a bunch of resources and links available to you, as well as a copy of this PowerPoint. But thank you all for letting me talk to you today, and I'd love to answer any questions you may have.
Feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat. A lot of thank yous for you, Maggie, in the chat.
No questions. I always tell my students, if there are no questions, that means I did a perfect job, explained everything 100%. Yes, I see a question, Aisha.
Yeah, so everything you've said is great, but at the same time, it's also things that the trans community at CU has been saying for years. And I've been brushed off by administration, by people in like the Idea Council when reaching out on like accessible gender neutral bathrooms and things. Do you have any thoughts on ways we can maybe get more attention from campus and actually get some action taken versus just continuous talking?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't have all the answers here. I feel like these are the struggles that are not unique to any one campus. I see this time and time again. I think there's, of course, power in numbers and there's power in money. If there is a way to physically, I'm not advocating for violence here, but like to actually show up physically and have people realize that there's power in numbers advocating for this, I think that's really powerful. I've seen the power of protest. I've seen the power of petitions, especially led by students and alumni. That's been very, very impactful. I also think there needs to be buy-in from leadership. It needs the work needs to trickle up, but there also has to be buy-in and understanding from the top as well why it's important. So that's where this both and also still comes in, where we need to have education as well. I unfortunately don't have all the answers in terms of getting action beyond that. My animals are rebelling here because they know it's dinner time. But definitely at least in that way. And I also think that in many ways, as we recognize that gender impacts us all, that's also where a lot of this work is going to come from. Recognizing that it's not just impacting trans communities, but it's impacting us all. Everyone has a shared stake in this work. And so everyone needs to buy into this work as well, because it will the outcomes will also impact us all. Another hand, Lauren.
Yeah, I have a question which I have not, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate in my head, but my kid kept me up for hours last night, so I'm a little tired, but so it's not going to be clear at all. So I'm just going to try to put it out there and you can try to figure it out. So there's a way in which I, as a trans person, feel like I have low resilience to administrative burden. Like, you know, I'm sort of used to having spent a life having people tell me no for various reasons. And then also like, there's just a lot of administrative stuff to do. And I was wondering sort of, and I was thinking about that in particular, but I was wondering more generally if there's ways in which like, I mean, I don't think a cisgender person is going to be like, oh, the trans people on campus are going to have more problems with administrative burdens than other people because there are these burdens and because of all this gaslighting and all this stuff. And so I was wondering if you had any other, like, if you see that, you know, maybe I'm unique, but if you see stuff like that, and if you see, if there's ways in which like there's those sort of patterns that are showing up that are more subtle that you found sort of most interesting in the way that in which, you know, students are really struggling to navigate the system. Like Devin's story was sort of like powerful and strong, and I was also wondering if there's some of that other stuff there too.
Yeah, so as you were talking, I was rummaging through my book bag because as an academic, I of course have a book recommendation. It's blurring. Let's see if I can get it. There we go. It's called Trans in College by Z. Nicolazzo. Highly recommend. It specifically looks at transgender students' strategies for navigating college campus environments and resiliency. And there's much of my work is inspired by Z's work, because he was on my dissertation committee, full disclosure there. But one of the things that Z focuses on is resilience, and what does resilience look like? And sometimes resilience just looks like rest. Sometimes resilience looks like forming communities. One of my favorite sections of Z's book talks about how these trans students created this like little organization club, and I think they called it the Tea Committee, but don't quote me on that. But they would go and just talk about things that weren't trans related, but being in that community together. And sometimes community, and Z actually just published a brand new book that I have not read yet about what resiliency looks like online in particular, and reimagining those kinship networks. I think also, yeah, we just need to also recognize animals. We need to recognize that this work is hard. And so we can't just shoulder that burden our individual selves. And so making sure we take that time to rest is really, really important. And I've lost my train of thought since then, but I do highly recommend Z's book for more recommendations on resiliency for sure.
Thanks. We can't hear your animals, by the way. You're all good.
Oh, that's good. That's good, because they are definitely scuffling.
We do have one more question for you in the chat, if you have time, if you wouldn't mind hanging on.
Yeah.
Aiden said, Maggie, I wonder if you have seen anything in the way of mandatory training or education for all students. At my previous university, many students did a sort of freshman orientation course, but nothing about LGBTQ+ topics was included. The most educational resource, besides taking an entire queer or gender studies course or joining a student group, was a day-long seminar of speakers and meeting people. The first year I went, the student body president was on a panel and complained about how LGBTQ+ people view allies. He nor anyone on student body was invited back on the panel the next year. All that to say, even the people meant to be figureheads and or educational are not trained properly. I wonder if you have seen any universities or colleges that require a queer or gender studies course for a major other than queer or gender studies.
I actually have not seen of a university requiring gender studies courses. I'm thinking just from my own field work, there was in the two universities that I studied, during orientation, there was I I think it was trans-specific speaker. Not all students were in attendance, but it was highly encouraged. But I've never heard of anything being mandatory. I do think that there is a movement, and I have seen movement of institutions creating diversity requirements for their students' courses. And that could be just like a designation, right? Kind of like a writing intensive course or what have you. They have a diversity designation. And so it's not always talking about gender identity, but that is the one movement that I have seen. And so there is more potentiality of students being exposed to this material, but it's not always guaranteed. I also think it's important to think about how this work should not necessarily just be siloed into gender studies courses, because if we're thinking intersectionally, gender studies or transgender topics, transgender issues need to come up in race courses, need to come up in biology courses, even in mathematics. I always get professors who are like, oh, not mathematics, I don't understand how it works, but it does, it still comes up. Engineering courses. I think it needs to be more broad than just siloed into one course, because if it's just siloed into one course, students will take that one course and then forget about it or leave it behind. Whereas if it's integrated throughout the entirety of their 4, 5, 6 years, that exposure, that repeated exposure means that there's a continued commitment, but then we can also see how it's intersectional and how it's integrated throughout the entirety of our lives. See another question. Has anywhere looked at requiring regular diversity inclusion training for tenure track faculty? Actually, the institution that I work at, East Carolina University, their faculty senate just passed this requirement, and it starts this year. So there is a DEI professional development requirement. Faculty, staff get to, or faculty, not staff, faculty get to choose what that looks like. But OED, the office that I work in, Office for Equity and Diversity, is putting out a number of different trainings in collaboration with other centers on campus for them to choose from. So yes, I have seen it. I don't know its effects yet, just because it's brand new to us. But I hope to be able to report back that it works.
The Boulder Faculty Senate, for those that don't know, actually just passed recently something like a sort of DEI needing to be part of faculty review. And I'm not sure if that was for, you know, merit review or post-tenure review or what have you. I don't know the specifics of that. But I don't see any more questions in the chat. I wanted to give everyone a big thank you for not just showing up, but participating the way everyone did. It was really great. I'm putting in the chat a link to our Qualtrics form. If you have the time, please fill it out. It would be really helpful. It just helps us get a better idea of what events or workshops that are really helpful to you and what you would like to see more of or less of. Once again, thank you so much to Maggie for facilitating this. It was great. And I hope you're all staying warm and healthy. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and I hope your dogs get fed soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.